It's my really great pleasure and privilege to introduce to you again Dr. Santos. Dr. Santos is the chair of art history here at the university. He has a very stellar educational background. I'm going to mention a few things about what he's interested in and what he's done, not to dazzle you, but to illustrate something that I think is going to come out in his talk today, which is he has very broad and creative intertextual, interdisciplinary interests. His education was at the University of Rome to start with, BA, MA, then University of Bologna for a PhD, and then postgraduate, postdoctoral studies at the Italian Institute for Humane Sciences. I think we would call that humanities?
That's right.
Okay. And here's some course titles for you. Introduction to Renaissance and Early Modern Art. Art Historical Inquiry. What is art about? I'd like to hear that, just as a topic by Baroque and Neoclassical Visual Culture, Renaissance Visual Culture, Literature and Criticism, Theories and Methodologies of Art History. He's also studied the work of European artists in the Orient, in India, China, and Japan. He's interested in Brazilian art. He's interested particularly in historiography. Historiography is the theory of how history is to be put together, how to write it, how to think about it and organize it. And the topic today is one aspect of historiography. How and why is art history broken up into periods? The same may be applied to how are other aspects of history, social history, intellectual history, military history, grouped in periods of time. And I don't think I'm going to go any further than that, except to please to invite you to give Dr. Santos a warm ICL welcome.
Thank you. Can we have the lights a little dimmed down? The lights? Can you hear me? I feel a little robotic, but is that all right for you, the sound? Not quite. Okay, I feel like in a Aldous Huxley's play, so Brave New World. Well, first of all, I would like to thank you for the invitation and to apologize for not have been able to come here last semester in a most awkward and ridiculous accident. I was getting started to lecture in the so-called family weekend at Willamette University when I turned my body in a way and I injured myself so badly, so severely that I had to cancel classes for over 4 weeks, unheard of. So now I am going to lecture very, stiff, and I apologize for that, but no motion, or at least no Baroque convoluted motions at all. Now the topic today, it's as basic as it is complex, because we're talking about how the study and therefore the narrative of art and the interpretation of art has been organized. What I would like to explore with you are a few models that are very important for our understanding of how art has been not so much conceived as described and narrated over time and across multiple cultures, particularly, of course, in Europe, from the antiquity up to the 19th century. Needless to say, we have barely 2 hours, even though, as usual, I would love to kidnap you all for at least 12 days so we could extensively talk about this subject, but I'll try my best to be very selective and address a few models from Pliny the Elder up to Johann Joachim Winckelmann that have really set some parameters, concepts, and ideas that we are still using nowadays. So again, our understanding of our current postmodern situation is largely based on our interpretation and understanding of the past. The first problem with periodization of art, the very concept, art. We are assuming something that may be more problematic than we could think of. In fact, in the periodization of art, we assume Could we have this light off, please? Because it's striking the image. Is there a way that we could have the light a little darker here? Oh, my, that's a little too dark. I'm scared, so please, a little light here. What we have, as I was about to say, is the assumption that many different artifacts, many different works from the so-called Venus of Willendorf that dates back 30,000 years ago to Henri Matisse's 1952 collage representing the blue nude, or a reliquary dating back the 13th century as a container of religious relics, could be somehow set upon and connected with another kind of container of modern relics or modern work of art, such as the Bilbao Guggenheim. So in other words, what is it that allows us to create a periodization in which we have this huge timeline from the Venus of Willendorf up to postmodern architecture? And sometimes we feel very uncomfortable with the kinds of and typologies of works that we are getting involved in this timeline, because we're assuming that they're sharing some components, some qualities, and therefore we can refer to them as art. But very often, it's not the case. Not only culturally and chronologically, but also geographically, that implies so many problems, because most of the times we have a very Eurocentric narrative, forgetting or neglecting many other cultural settings, from Oceania to Africa, from South America to Asia. So what I would like to discuss with you is certain models that have been very influential in the making of a narrative, and therefore the construction of the timeline of periods in art, mostly Western art, from times that would be the antiquity up to the 20th century art. Here, for instance, we have a very standard kind of periodization, according, first of all, to geographical patterns, and then within the geography, the chronology. What has happened in France during the Middle Ages, then the Renaissance, then the 16th, then the 17th century, etc. And interestingly, as I will point out more in detail throughout the lecture, some periods, they do have a nomenclature, a designation. Gothic, Romanesque, Renaissance, some others they don't. And I, for instance, I'm growing cautious in using those terminologies such as Renaissance, Baroque, as a chronological criteria. Because the Renaissance could be much longer than the 15th or the 16th century. As a matter of fact, there have been some reassessment in the terminology, and very recently a colleague of mine from the University of Toronto published a book on the Gothic Renaissance. That is to say, a particular branch of the Renaissance in late 16th century that, regardless of the late chronology, are still working according to the basic tools and procedures of what we had called Gothic. So what's the difference of the 13th century Gothic and the 16th century Gothic? So those are questions pertaining to periodization. And the timeline very often implies also not only the development of the arts, the increasing, the refinement of techniques, of styles, of subject matters, but also, and this is a notion I would like to explore with you, the concept of progress. That what comes later is somehow superior, or it is made on the basis of what had come first. And therefore, there is a transformation. And that would explain the improvement on the Gothic for the Renaissance, and then the transformation in Mannerism, and then Baroque, and the Rococo, and then we're going to see that it's far more nuanced and problematic than that. So I would like to move backwards and get started with the very question of not only art in its plurality across and over time, but also the very concept of time. We assume that there is a scientific, a standard way to measure time, but as we know, the narratives related to time are very different depending on the context. For a 14th century French merchant, time had different systems of measurement. For a religious person in the 11th century in Spain, time had yet another set of connotations. The cyclical time of the Bible, we were created, we're living in the meantime, but waiting for the end of the days and therefore the last judgment. So those narratives, they're very different from our current, more linear periodization. And yet, even what appears to be linear, plain, and simple is, as a matter of fact, filled with ideologies and constructed notions that I would like to elaborate and articulate with you. One, for instance, starts here, 1st century after Christ. In the age of Augustus, we have one of the most highly influential narratives of the development and therefore the progress of the arts, Pliny the Elder. But Pliny the Elder was not an art historian, of course. There was no such a category. He was trying to describe what he called the history of natural phenomena, so naturalis historia, or natural history, and therefore in over 42 volumes, he devoted in this most encyclopedic construction parts of the natural world to his descriptions and his explanations. Geological formations, some problems related to waters, the weather, and so forth. And in the volume 35 in particular, he has to deal with stones, with metals. And those elements from nature, they have been used for so many different purposes, including what appeared to be very peculiar to Pliny the Elder, a use that was not merely functional. Artists, or some people, he doesn't use the word artist, but some masters, they used stones in a variety of forms, marbles or metals differently in order to build something that could be pragmatically useful, a spoon, a knife, or also houses, or also something that was used to decorate those constructions. And therefore he started in the book 35 to describe the different ways in which those materials were used. And because the materials imply techniques, imply certain technologies, he described both the technology, but more importantly, and that's the distinctive feature of Pliny the Elder, the individual talent and the ways in which individual masters have improved upon technicalities or procedures. So it was not only operational, but it was creative. In fact, he described all typologies of stones, and along with that, the ways in which they were applied, carved, modeled. And they were carved, modeled according to a sequence that was both individual and collective. What Pliny the Elder was the very first source to point out is the fact that while you can see some kind of very individualized, very subjective and personal features, oh, this is the way this particular master has used this tool, the chisel, in order to carve this stone. But at the same time, within a society, within a community, there were some common features. So it was not just personal. There was something recurrent, and it became more and more a form of a family resemblance. So he describes the way in which these collectively shared techniques or visual solutions have been improved thanks to individual talents. And there was one goal that he noticed at the very end of his narrative. Artists, they had to invent upon. They were not necessarily trained at the very beginning. In fact, the earliest masters, well, they had to try, they had to experiment, they had to make mistakes. And out of those mistakes, they built up a system, a form of knowledge that they could then transmit or teach to others. And those others, they were not merely absorbed, but they would interpret and transform. And what Pliny the Elder noticed is that while they were adopting those solutions, those techniques, they tried to get closer and closer to the very reality of nature. So if at first they appeared a little rigid, stiff, and even the best attempts in the archaic period, they tried to represent motion according to formulas that were already diffused in Egypt, and therefore they look so geometric, but there is a sort of a scheme of representation of motion. Over time, thanks to the talent of individual masters and the experiment of different solutions, they're going to improve upon. So they're going to get closer and closer to nature. But that's not enough. Because once you reach the state of imitating nature as it appears, then, says Pliny the Elder, they started thinking the ways they could improve upon nature. Not only reaching the natural state, but overcoming it. So in the case of Belvedere Apollo, here, of course, in a later period, he has improved upon the rigidity, the fixity of those formulas, so the naturalness of the motion is more visually compelling, but also morphologically convincing. But even more importantly than that, he has created certain modes to improve upon nature. So this is not just natural, it is idealized. The master here, Apelles, well, he had ideas in his mind. So what he was really looking forward was to imitating not only the visible world, that was a premise, but certain ideas that he might have had in his mind. So here you have the naturalness and the idealization together. Then Pliny the Elder, if you read the book, which is wonderful, the 35th, it's really very intriguing because sometimes he arranges the periodization first in blocks, archaic, and gradually more and more naturalistic. But his very point is what we would call nowadays biographical, because he wants to tell us story about the individuals behind the creation of these works. What was it that made Zeuxis, Parrhasius, Praxiteles prefer or find certain forms instead of the others? And he's going to use for the very first time what we again could call the psychological dimension. They were not just mere technicians who were exploring techniques, procedures, but they were men, women, and they had therefore their expectations, their frustrations, and sometimes Pliny the Elder is going to tell us delightful, sometimes awkward, gloomy stories, anecdotes about their lives, because an artist is somehow expressing part of his or her lives as well. So he is going to be very straightforward, and for instance, he's going to name who was the first one who invented the smile, the first one who painted the smile with pink, the first one who represented the smile with teeth, without teeth, with tongue, without. So it is really a list of inventions. And those inventions are going to be details at first, and then they are going to be cumulative. So through the accumulation of those inventions, we have the general, collectively shared improvement of the visual arts, up to the point in which they are going also to express feelings such as fear, sorrow. Who was the first one who has invented the figures crying? Then, after that, the one who wanted to create ambiguity, the one who wanted to create riddles, visual riddles, or figures that were enigmatic. So there is a genealogy for every typology of art. Now, can you imagine that? There is one part, though, in the narrative of Pliny the Elder that it's very intriguing. While he stresses how individuals shared their technicalities and their own styles in order to get closer and closer to the variety of nature, there is one field that those recent first-century artists working for late Augustus and also Nero, I can't stand. The ones who are creating bizarre, grotesque figures, the so-called grotesque because they came from the grottos. And they are not very similar. They are not true. And they are pathetic. And because of that, they are fantastic. They are not icastic. So Pliny the Elder, he is very resentful against those artists. So for him, the maximum, the ultimate expression of art is creativity, provided that it is still within the boundaries of naturalness, of something that resembles nature. If you're going to cross the line and you're going to be, as he says, with your crickets in your brain, grilli, crickets, then you are going no longer to look at nature, but you are going to get confused, thus making audiences confused. What's the purpose of such a painting? For Pliny the Elder, this goes against the paradigm. So if this could be the borderline of something that it's extreme, that it's expressive, and it's highly individual, excellent. But this goes beyond. It's fantastic. It's too much of a liberty and of a freedom. And interestingly, this notion of freedom is the one condensed in the largest biography written by Pliny the Elder. In the Periodization of the Art, from the antiquity, according to Pliny, that is to say, Sumerians and Egyptians, we had a gradual development and progress of the art. But this progress has reached a state of perfection. And perfection was represented by this master, Apelles, the prince of the arts. And the narrative is going to be so influential that many later biographers, such as Leon Battista Alberti, Giorgio Vasari, Leonardo Da Vinci himself, they are going to model their very behaviors in accordance with the lines, the features, the qualities of Apelles, the prince, the unreachable paradigm of perfection. Why? Because according to Pliny the Elder, he has, of course, like all previous masters, he has observed quite carefully nature. And more importantly, the variety of nature. So, varietas, variety. And variety was completely represented by him, not only because he observed nature, but because he has a specific natural talent. So, varietas becomes a category for Pliny to praise both the multiplicity of forms in the natural world, but also the heterogeneity of artists, or what he calls the personal talent. That's not enough, because Apelles, being the peak of the periodization, the ending of the progress, he has condensed, he has improved everything. He was able to represent all parts of the nature, as well as quote and reuse all previous style. So he had in himself the variety of nature and personal talents. But he used them with knowledge. He used them in a selective way. So that's the point that Pliny makes. What really characterizes Apelles as a master is not his ability, his manual dexterity, but the fact that the hands were following the desires and the directions prescribed by the intellect. So he was selectively providing an imitation of nature and a display of his personal talent. And in fact, he used his judgment with an intellectual, rational category. And therefore, he made up inventions. And because of that, Pliny the Elder is going to praise Apelles as the prince. He has created, upon the past, new inventions. From this moment on, in the narrative of all or most periodizations of art, originality and inventivity or inventiveness, they are going to become essential paradigms. Now, does it ring any bell? Don't we highly praise originality and capacity of invention nowadays? So the more inventive is an artist, the more creative he or she is, well, so much better their works. So basically, we're still working and borrowing out of Pliny the Elder's narrative. And so did one of the greatest sources in the Renaissance, Giorgio Vasari, the father of modern historiography of art, because he knew Pliny the Elder. He was aware that he was borrowing from a model, but as a historian and a historiographer, he knew that he had to somehow contextualize Pliny, classify his categories, and create upon them. In the case of Giorgio Vasari, his most important contribution to periodization is Le vite dei più eccellenti architetti, pittori e scultori italiani, or the lives of the most illustrious architects, painters, and sculptors. It was first published in Florence in 1550. Interestingly, the book is going to be a major bestseller, and just 18 years later, there will be a second edition from 1 volume to 3, largely increased, and the title itself is going to change the order. It's no longer going to be the lives of architects, painters, and sculptors. So the supremacy here stands on the side of architects, but the lives of painters, sculptors, and architects. And he's going to use a word that is not Italian, it's not Tuscan. Here he uses architetti, even nowadays in modern Italian. But in the second edition, it's going to be architettori, with a slightly different connotation. There are still many debates and scholarly publications about that, but it's intriguing to see that in 18 years, the very hierarchical disposition of the arts have changed. And along with that, so has the periodization. In fact, here, Giorgio Vasari creates 3 different ages. There are 3 different periods: antiquity, old, and modern. It's interesting because he refers to the past as being the ancient past, namely Greece, Rome, the greatness of ancient Rome, the antiquity, that should be followed, that set the model that Pliny the Elder had described, and this misconceived dark period in which all knowledge went lost, what he calls the Dark Ages. Nowadays we would call the Middle Ages. And then what he calls moderno, modern, current, present, art of this day. So we are trying to create a periodization into 3 ages, 3 periods. The greatness of antiquity, the decay of the old, and now this in-between situation of modern. So he wants to create an army, a group, a team of new artists, modern, that are no longer going to be influenced by the misleading roles and lack of talent of the old Middle Ages, but are going to retrieve the paradigms of antiquity. He does that, but he does that with having a very clear geographical, political, and I would say topographical agenda. Look at the main cover here. The design is very relevant because we do have, in almost a theatrical way, the presentation through a gateway, architecturally inscribing the lives with 2 figures standing in the sides, and then those 2 putti, they're opening up very theatrically a curtain. And what emerges, it's clearly a topography, the city of Florence. So basically his agenda is, yes, I am going to create the periodization of antiquity, Middle Ages, and Renaissance. However, my main point is to establish the supremacy of all artists who were either born or lived in Florence. Therefore, I am going to promote the idea, which is still very, very rooted in our culture, that Renaissance is essentially Italian, and within Italy is first and foremost Florentine. He did it because even nowadays, if I would make a sort of a test here, say a name of an artist in the Renaissance, Leonardo, Botticelli, well, they are not very Spanish or very Portuguese. They are Italian and they are Tuscans. So his historical construction within the periodization is really long-standing. First, there is an empty, a vacant place. At first, there used to be great masters, and Pliny the Elder had told us so. Apelles, Zeuxis, Parrhasius, Praxiteles, and I could keep going on and on. Then there was this lack of talent, this lack of knowledge, the decay of the arts after Constantine, and therefore after the 4th century. For at least 10 centuries, we have an empty. See, we don't know any names, we don't know any artists who need or deserve being known. So that's why Giorgio Vasari is going to refer to the Middle Ages as the dark ages of ignorance in which the arts decayed to the point that in many places they disappeared altogether. So it's now our task, aesthetic, but also ethical, to retrieve the greatness of the antiquity. So we're going to fill this vacant Middle Ages with great talent. talents, with names. And the one who, according to Giorgio Vasari, started the new periodization, and therefore he retrieved the naturalness of nature, the same paradigm that Pliny the Elder had established, is Giotto. And Giotto, according to Giorgio Vasari, is going to be very important a master because of his creative talent, and he is going to open the first age. He's going to be followed by another generation of masters, which we would refer to as basically 15th century masters, and that's what Vasari calls the second age. The second age is inaugurated by Masaccio. So Giotto inaugurates the Renaissance, the rebirth, the rinascita, as Vasari puts it, but he opens up the road. He doesn't reach perfection. He's talented, he was innovative, but he was not perfect. In fact, he was lacking of something that Masaccio and the masters of the second generation, the second état, they are going to improve upon. And yet, they are going to follow certain roles, certain models, to the point that they are going to become too, Giorgio Vasari's words, dry. They are no longer going to create figures that are unpredictable, that are beautiful, they're gracious, but are too mathematically driven, and therefore they will look so correct, but no longer creative. So the master who is going to solve the problem and push forward this whole periodization is no one else than Leonardo da Vinci. Leonardo da Vinci is going to inaugurate, according to Vasari, the third age. Giotto the first, Masaccio the second, Leonardo the third. Now, what is so interesting from an interpretive standpoint is that this is roughly chronological. We may imply that Giotto, 14th century, Masaccio, 15th century, then Leonardo, 16th century. However, many of the masters of the 16th century, they critically belong in Vasari's narrative to the second age. While Leonardo, who was born in 1452, 15th century, he was set as the beginning of the third age. So the periodization here is not strictly chronological, but it's more critical, and I would even claim aesthetically based. So there are criteria of innovation. And in fact, the end of the periodization set by Vasari is Michelangelo Buonarroti. If you look at the works, you are going to see that in fact, Giotto, he has observed natural forms, and he tried his best to render volume, chiaroscuro. Here, for instance, you have no lines. He's modeling the figure in accordance with the variations of light and shades as to create the optical illusion of roundness, of volume, unheard of. Giorgio Vasari is going to say something very poetic. He's going to argue that Giotto has invented or retrieved shadows. Prior to Giotto, figures didn't cast shadows. And as a matter of fact, if you look at Byzantine mosaic, they have all schemes and all silhouettes, but no shadows. So the structures, the constructions, they sit there, but they don't cast shadows, which means that they don't have that roundness, that it's also vividness of actual figures, actual beings. So Giotto inaugurates the second age. But Giorgio Vasari is also very mean and naughty, and he says, he's good, but he represents in the periodization the childhood of art. His figures are awkward, goffe. Then comes the next generation, the one inaugurated by Masaccio, but set into perfection or to improved perfection by Piero della Francesca, a very good friend of Leonardo da Vinci, for instance. And yet, Piero has improved upon natural forms because he has also observed not only nature, as Giotto did, but he thought of more mathematical, geometrical, and therefore rational patterns of measurement. And his figures, they are more like a visual theorem than the imitation of natural forms. And for that matter, he has created figures that are beautiful, but are not perfect, according to Vasari, because they became extensively dry, secche e dure, dry and rigid. The master, who is going to create or to provide new breathing forms upon this measurement is Leonardo da Vinci. And Vasari is going to argue that he opens the third element, the third age, the age of the beautiful manner, because he's going to give to his figures il moto e il fiato, the motion and the breath. So the figures, they look as though they were there. And there is not only the figure in opposition, in contrast with the setting, but the space, the interaction, what is between figure and landscape is there. Here, even in the so-called self-portrait, which I and many of my colleagues do not believe it's an actual self-portrait of Leonardo, but the representation of a philosopher, namely Aristotle. Here, in this head of elderly figure, we have something that it's smoky, that it's indeterminate, undefined. Look at the top of the head. Nothing is there. Look at the beard. Look at the openness of forms. So he represents that kind of vividness, of living forms, of actual, natural, breathing figures that Giorgio Vasari so extensively praised. And yet, he hasn't reached perfection yet. Perfection is going to be reached by this man, according to Giorgio Vasari, Michelangelo Buonarroti. Because Michelangelo, he was able not only to repeat all canons and all forms that Pliny the Elder had explained in his periodization, from archaic to Hellenistic, from classical to natural, and he's going to make out of David a form of art that is somehow superior to all ancient examples, according to Giorgio Vasari. So there is a form of transhistoricity here. He was in a rivalry, in a sort of a creative competition, not only with local contemporary artists, but more widely with antiquity. And so was Giorgio Vasari with Pliny the Elder. But what makes Michelangelo unique is the fact that even in that regard, he broke the tradition. He invented something, inventio, as Pliny the Elder had praised, that nobody else had ever dared. He created forms that are unformed, informal, not shaped, not just expressive as Laocoon that has been reached by the antiquity. No, Michelangelo has created that license, that liberty, that new freedom that Vasari himself doesn't know how to conceptualize. He offers this word, license. Isn't it what we still nowadays praise in an art? Something that is so free, so fresh, and original. Original in detriment to imitation. So what Michelangelo does here, he not only somehow improves upon nature and antiquity, but he opens up a new kind of periodization. Why? Once you have reached perfection, what's next? Isn't it the very cyclicity of the time as it was described by many religious sources during the Middle Ages? Once you have reached the state of returning to paradise, there is no longer time. It's timelessness now. And in the case of the arts, we are talking about beginning, childhood, adolescence, maturity, and then what? Perfection. Good. But once you have reached perfection, what remains to be done? And Michelangelo, he not only closed the periodization, he closed the periodization in all three major arts: architecture, painting, and sculpture. My goodness, collective suicide. What should I do as an artist? Nothing else. And interestingly, in 1550, the first edition, well, it's not that I cried, but I really was weeping when I read, because you have this sense of fear. Giorgio Vasari was both an architect and a painter, and he claims, and he was a very good friend, acquaintance of Michelangelo. What should I do? How can I live next to a giant who has somehow closed the periodization of art? He has put to perfection the past and closed any possibility for the future, because he himself is perfection. There is the sense of decay, of decadence. Giorgio Vasari finds a brilliant solution for that. Really brilliant. So brilliant that we are still working on that very hypothesis. If the first edition ends with Michelangelo on the top. Perfection has been reached. Well, let's mourn. Let's go to the mass celebration, the funeral, because art is done. No, the second edition has a different take. First, second, third age. Giotto, Masaccio, Leonardo. In the first edition, Vasari argued that Leonardo was inevitably superior to both Masaccio and Giotto. Chronologically, the periodization itself does so. What comes later is inevitably better because improved upon the past. And yet, when I look at Giotto, even in that awkwardness of his, in that kind of childish naivete of his figures, and I'm using, of course, Giorgio Vasari's perception, not mine, I just love the guy. But then when you look at those imperfections, to use Vasari's perception, they still have something perfect. It's not just naivete out of lack of talent, but it's a talent that belongs to his possibilities, culturally, chronologically, but also individually. So he thinks in a sense that it's trans-historical. And he dares suggest that had Giotto lived in the 16th century, he would still be Giotto. So in other words, there is something that it's not only chronologically a progress, but it's subjectively related to the individuality of the artist. So maybe, and that opens up the possibility for the second edition, there is not just one perfection that has been reached by Michelangelo. There are many other perfections and degrees of perfections reached by individuals. So there will be a Giottesque perfection. There will be a Raphaelesque imperfection. There will be a Michelangelesque. And it's not more or less. It's different because individual. And he's going to use, don't forget, we're in 1568. The Council of Trent is reassessing the very dogmas of the Catholic Church. And along with that, many of the notions of predestination, free will, and therefore Giotto, Masaccio, Leonardo, they are reinterpreted according to this light. And they're going to be seen as individuals whose free will or naturally born and God-given gifts were diverse, different. And therefore, from the nouns of the great construction of 1550, Giotto, Masaccio, Leonardo, Michelangelo, and Giorgio Vasari is going to create what I call the adjectivation of the second edition. There will be a perfection that is Giottesque, Michelangelesque, Raphaelesque, so it's no longer chronological. He breaks down the periodization, opens up the future. So there is no longer fear that after Michelangelo we're going to decay, because if this art and perfection are essentially related to the inner qualities of diverse artists and their personal talents, there will be always art as long as there will be individuals. So that's a great solution that's indeed going to be further developed by this other treatise. Karel van Mander, which has been published in Haarlem, northern of Amsterdam, in 1604, and it's called Het Schilderboek, or the Book on Painting. So he is going to devote his narrative and his periodization only in the development of the painting. What he does is very Vasarian. So he uses the adjectivation created by Vasari in order to situate arts and periodization in ways that are very intriguing. First of all, not three ages, as Vasari did, but three cultural contexts. We have, instead of first age, second age, third age, we have one context, antiquity. And in the antiquity, as it was described by Pliny the Elder, you have masters trying to somehow conquer nature in a variety of forms, not only human bodies, but animals, landscapes, plants, variety. Then there was a second period, not chronology, but geography, Italy. In Italy, well embedded by Michelangelo, Leonardo, and Raphael, well, they have repeated and improved one particular tendency of the antiquity. the anthropocentric forms. So they have reached perfection in that field, Van Mander is going to argue. So Michelangelo, he is perfect indeed in the depiction of human bodies. And that's just one part of the main legacy of the antiquity. But what about landscapes? What about animals? What about plants? What about thunders? What about light effects? No Italian has ever dealt with. So that's exactly the territory in which Northerners, Flemings, or Flemish artists, they are going to be a periodization on its own. So 3 different periods that correspond to what we would call nowadays cultural context. But what makes the supremacy of Flemish is really something. We have said that according to Pliny the Elder, art has as its main goal to imitate nature. For Vasari, you have to improve upon nature, and you have to reach a degree of liberty, of creativity that it's individual. What Van Mander is going to argue is that art is going to imitate not nature, but itself. And the more art is going to reflect and somehow improve upon itself, so much the better. So in a sense, a work such as this one here by Hendrik Horst's is the ultimately expression of perfection. Why? If I were to ask you, what does it represent? Mercury, Hermes, Mercury. So a mythological figure. How does it represent it? What's the technique? What kind of engraving is that? Do you know? Etching, right? And in the etching, a very particular kind of etching. This one here, the burring. So you have, due to the very, I would say, harshness of the material, you have the metal, and then you have the burring, and you have to carve the lines. That's the reason why, even in the Renaissance, they are going to use the same verb for etching, engraving methods, and sculptural methods. They're going to be carved, just like in English, because you have to somehow extract from the metal, from the matrix, lines. It was so harsh that sometimes Van Mander considers the possibility that you would have steady in your hand the burring, this kind of metal pointed thing, and then you would turn the plate. And that would explain those curvilinear hatchings that are the typical features of the engraving. But guess what? This is not an engraving. This is a freehand drawing, imitating the results, the procedures of an engraving. In fact, if you look here, they are looser. They're freer. But here, it looks like an etching, but it's not. So you are going to admire, along with the subject, along with the cleverness of the artist, his manual dexterity, which is, again, not simply manual, but it is a form of judgment that follows the interests, I would say, in the directions of the intellect. So you, audience, you're going to feel deceived that your eyes have been somehow, oh my God, it's not what you thought. Exactly what art is for, according to Van Mander. So it's not only an imitation of nature, but an imitation of itself. But according to creative modes that are going to surprise the audiences. In fact, this narrative is going to change. But about this change, I would like to talk afterwards. So I would like to invite us all to have a 10-minute break, to have some Leonardesque breath. So then we can come back. Now it's 2:15. Oh, 2:20. So is that all right for you if we meet again at 2:30? Okay, very good. Can you hear me? So welcome back, and let's get started again. So we could please time the light. Well, at first, we've been talking about some very important models to understand our periodization of art, Antiquity, Middle Ages, and Renaissance. And even though they are, of course, related to those early modern periods, many of the categories, the methodologies that they apply, Pliny the Elder, Giorgio Vasari, and Carl van Mander, they are so instructive and they offer so many insights that even nowadays, currently, we're still working on the basis of many of their categories. We're still talking about inventiveness. We are still praising originality. We still try to understand how certain techniques have been transformed into style, depending on a society, a community, or more importantly, individual artists. Now, in the second part, I would like to change our approach. Because so far, we've been talking about periodization as a progression, as a development over time based on biographies. So we can name the artists. Pliny the Elder, Giorgio Vasari, and Carl van Mander, while they are trying to understand the general development of a canon, how from very impoverished and very simple beginnings, art has reached different kinds and different modes of perfection. They are all based on the inventiveness, on the contribution of individual artists. Well, in 1764, a book was published that has radically changed this approach. And this book was printed by Johann Joachim Winckelmann, who is usually nicknamed as the forerunner or the father of archaeology, because in fact, he was a librarian. He lived at first in Dresden, and from Dresden, he embraced Catholicism just to become the librarian of Pope. And in Rome, he was the responsible for the antiquities of the city, a major, major task, because it entailed not only the organization, but also the classification and the knowledge of the variety of artistic phenomena in Rome, from the 5th century before Christ up to the 4th century after Christ. So he had to deal with the antiquity. And the first element that Winckelmann was so concerned about, the very concept, antiquity. Pliny the Elder, Giorgio Vasari, even Carl van Mander, they all refer to antiquity, or in the case of Carl van Mander, antiquities in the plural. And Winckelmann knew Carl van Mander. He was a German. He was one of the few art historians or early archaeologists who were able to read Flemish. And that's the reason why we have this genealogical connection. While Giorgio Vasari has written his book in the lingua franca of the arts, every connoisseur, every dilettante from the 15th up to the 19th century was expected to know Italian. If you're interested in the arts, you ought to know Italian, and Giorgio Vasari was the main written source. As for Carl van Mander, he had a very different trajectory, because it was written in Flemish, never translated until the 20th century into German and modern Dutch. I mean, really, from Flemish to modern Dutch, what a distance, right? And just recently, a team from the University of Amsterdam, headed by Hessel Miedema, who just passed very recently. We were good, I wouldn't say friends, but we were good scholars, and we worked together. Well, he translated for the first time parts of Carl van Mander's book into English. And that's just to say that Winckelmann, being German, he knew Carl van Mander, and he knew, more importantly, the pluralization of antiquity. So that was highly seminal to his own agenda. Because when he reached Rome, interestingly, when you're coming to Rome, well, you're going to the epicenter of the antiquity. Many years ago, that's an anecdote, a personal one, I have never felt so humiliated. I went to Egypt. It was the second time. And I was with friends, and one of these friends was so rich and so well known, and so the guide was so, oh my God, are you the son? Yes, let's pretend. Let's pretend. If that's going to open the museums, we had a guided tour, 5 of us, in the National Museum of Cairo. And it was the year in which Sarkozy and Carla Bruni were there, so it was very, very gossipy, really gossipy. But what I remember is that this guy, you were from Rome, right? And I said, well, I'm not from Rome, but yes, I lived there for 25 years, so yes, let's say I'm from Rome. You Roman people, you believe that you were ancient? When you were in the 1st century, you were already in our 30th generation of pharaohs. We held the real antiquity. Well, it was a good learning experience indeed. But I dare say I was a little pedantic. I was much younger then, and I said, you know what? No news in the new that you were saying, because that's exactly what this guy has said. Winkelmann argued that it's very true that in Rome, we're mainly concerned with Roman or classical and therefore Greek tradition, but they're not the only ones. So he used the plural. The periodization is so much more complex, therefore, because of course what we have, first of all, in this book we have the Geschichte der Kunst des Altertums, or the history of the art of the antiquities. And in fact, antiquities for one reason, because we ought to conceive the past from the 30th century before Christ, Egyptians, Sumerians, etc., up to the 4th, 5th century after Christ. And then he made, for the first time, a very important archaeological distinction. Not only there are many different civilizations, and therefore different periodizations related to each one, but we do have different procedures, different expectations, and different functions of the art. So it's unthinkable that we could periodize everything and build up a sort of a timeline in relation exclusively to the Greek, Roman / classical tradition. Because Egyptians, Sumerians, they have never attempted at conquering, at representing what Romans or Greek did. So that's a very important distinction. He is going to devote parts of his book to many different civilizations, and each one in its own chronology, geography, and therefore systems of periodization. What is perfect, what is good, what is functional among Sumerians, among Egyptians, is drastically different from what might have been good to Greek. And yet, his canon, his love, was completely devoted to Greece. Ancient Greece occupies the core of his narrative. And in fact, even though he was very professional, very scholarly, and he differentiated all those civilizations, you can read as a subterranean thread of admiration, okay, now let's turn the page and read the Greek, not Romans. Romans, they have only copied what Greek had done best. And that's the main agenda. Can you imagine that kind of narrative in Rome for the Pope's collection? Oh, it's good because it's closer to the lost original. But be as it may, what he designates as a periodization, the different antiquities, but within each antiquity, he's going to focus not on biography, not on masters, but on style. That's for the first time a history of art without names, if you will. Sure, there are names here and there, and he mentions many autographies, many biographies, but this is not the core of his narrative. While he recalls that this is a sculpture attributed to Praxiteles, then he's going to meticulously describe, ekphrastically evoke the forms, the rendering, the texture, the technique. So if you don't know the name, but you are going to listen to his description, you are going to fully visualize the forms. And that's precisely the goal, because he wanted to form, wanted to create new archaeologists, so to speak. Why? Because he was dealing with the reorganization of the massive presence of fragments in Rome. Fragments that were brought to the city by many emperors, so they were not only Romans, there were Egyptians, Sumerians, you name it. So in front of this huge collection of unclassified, undefined antiquities, he had the major task of clarifying them, selectively organizing them, ordering. And then, needless to say, he is going to follow through also the same kind of Plinian narrative when it comes to the Greek and the Roman tradition, because he's aware that what Pliny had told us and what he had described corresponded to what Romans and Greek tried to do. So from the archaic, very Egyptian-oriented rigidity, the more fluid and improved forms of naturalness in the archaic period, and then in the classical or Hellenistic, in which artists, just like Pliny told us, they are going to improve upon nature. So he follows the periodization and even the chronological ascending narrative in the parts dedicated to Roman and Greek art, but not in the others. And what is so impressive is while Pliny the Elder named each one of the artists, some of them they are going to be the object of one line of description. And sometimes this line does not even refer to the work, but to his, her preferences. Oh, he used to drink a lot, and therefore, so there is very biographical. Here, no anecdotes. It was so drastic a shift and a change, so you don't have to know the life, the biographical, anecdotal life, but the creative style. So you're going to indeed form a new category of viewers, not biographers, not scholars, but connoisseurs, those who have the knowledge of the forms, those who can attribute. And in fact, he's going to highly admire all those pieces because they were in the Belvedere in the Vatican. And therefore, they are going to be examined quite exhaustively by Winkelmann, described and locate within the context of chronology. But there is something else. Interestingly, he's going to argue that perfection is not only something that a master out of his or her inventiveness have reached, but there is something that could be evoked, suggested. He's going to devote, and I'm not kidding, 35 pages of description of the Belvedere torso, which is a fragment. There is no comparing with the Laocoon or the Apollo Belvedere. Each one is going to become the symbol of a particular perfection. But the ultimate perfection, according to Winkelmann, is here, represented by the torso. Because, and not in detriment, but because of its state of fragmentation. Why? Because here what we have is an embedded lesson, but even more importantly, an exercise and a stimulus in imagination. Artists from Michelangelo up to Antonio Canova in the future, after Winkelmann, they would observe this form and try to reinterpret. They would continue it. So he will extensively talk about imagination as a pattern, an instructional structure for the future artists. Periodization, yes, but in the case of Winkelmann, there is a sense of timelessness. Wherever, whenever, whatever you are doing, the ultimate expression of a canon of perfection in art, ethics, is the Greek society of Polykletos, the one of the 5th century, the Athens of the 5th century. So it's interesting that it's very true that it's going to talk about different periods, different civilizations, and yet the only way that after all revolutions, and we are talking about 18th century, and in about 30 years, you know that the French Revolution and then the American Revolution, they're going to change quite drastically the social system and the political implications of that. So earlier, 30 years early, he's already claiming that the politics or the neoclassicism in art, they are fused together in this notion of democracy, of liberty of thoughts. And he is going to use a form of interpretation that it's not name-based. This is a very good exercise because, as a matter of fact, think about different antiquities. Think about the pre-Columbians. Think about Maya, Azteca culture. We have very few cases of signatures and names. And yet, what other instruments, what other parameters can we use in order to contextualize and therefore interpret those manifacts? So Winkelmann is very instructive methodologically speaking. That's the reason he's so modern as a source. Be as it may, what he is trying to make is to create also new forms of display. And his narrative is going to be highly influential to the European redesign and remodeling of many important museums, from the British Museum up to the Vatican museums. After and based on Winkelmann's remarks, many of the sections of antiquities, they're going to be completely rearranged. Because Winkelmann claimed that it was important, since we don't know many names, since we don't know many periods, we ought to focus on what he called iconography, different subjects, different themes, different typologies. So he invited, in the reconstruction of the museums, to have sections of portraiture, sections of vases, sections on numismatic, sections on columns, sarcophagi, each one within its own typology. And that's indeed what happened in the Vatican museums opened by Pius VII, in the British Museum, in the National... So we do have Winkelmann's ideas promoting a new form of looking at the art. And not by accident. What he is going to invite is that you have first the periodization completely extinguished, and we're going to have the iconography. And within each iconography, you're going to have particular works that are the most emblematic, the most representative one. And that's the reason why even the architecture has been redesigned in order to literally surround one particular artwork. And that's the beginning of a notion that you, as a viewer, as a beholder, you would travel, you would be well informed. So prior to reaching there, you are expected to inform and to form yourself, to read, to read, to read. You have to be trained. Once you are trained, you are going to selectively admire those masterpieces. This figure, prior to Winkelmann, had a name that was slightly negative. It was a figure that was not professionally trained. It was not an artist. It was not an academic. Sometimes it was someone who was filled with passion but doesn't have any background. So they were called or referred to as the dilettante, out of the Italian diletto, pleasure. So they had pleasure in going places and looking at them, but not necessarily they were experts or they were informed. That's the transformation. In the 18th century, the dilettante, they were expected to grow, to inform themselves, to read, to be familiar with Pliny the Elder, with Giorgio Vasari, and possibly with Winkelmann. So the dilettante is not only going to express his or her taste, which was the main category prior to Winkelmann. You would express your authoritative taste, your good or your bad taste. So taste had become a critical concept. No. After Winkelmann, the dilettante or the pleasure is going to become a form of knowledge. So you would be known as connoisseur. You would have, from the French verb connaître, to know, you would be informed. Your judgments, your considerations, the very fact that you prefer this to that is already a reflection, not of your taste, which is random, irregular, subjective. No, something controlled, something that can be cultivated, something that relates to your cultural background. And therefore, you're going to become a connoisseur. The connoisseurs are going to invade, literally, many countries with the phenomenon, which is a sort of an early mass tourism of grand tour. They are going, especially aristocrats, they're going to travel across Europe, mostly in Italy, sometimes in Spain, but mostly in Rome, Florence, Venice, and they're going to visit, to collect some of the journals, some of the diaries. They are priceless sources for us because they tell us not only where some artworks were preserved, their state of conservation, but also the former attribution. There are many Raphaels everywhere, there are many Leonardos everywhere, and they turn out to be not authentic. But be as it may, we have a new category of audience, well-versed and well-informed. In fact, the collection plays a very important role as a phenomenon in the periodization of art. When you have, such as 15th century Rome, all this mountain of antiquities, and then they were reorganized, first of all, within gardens. So you would have gardens all'italiana, geometrically shaped, in which you would walk around, and here and there you would find some examples of antiquity, but still out of diletto, out of pleasure. And that's the very beginning. So they were either at the very entrance or in the gardens of rich houses, rich villas, which was, of course, a status symbol. I have the patrimony of my family. Very often, those families, they would argue that there is a genealogical tie. So, for instance, the Farnese and the Medici as well, they're going to have a huge collection of Hercules, because they argued that Hercules was the great-great-great-great-great-grandfather of the family. So there is this kind of mythological connection, not metaphorical. Sometimes, especially in the third, fourth decades of the 16th century, they're going to forge, to create documentation certifying that here, Venus, my great-grandmother, and there you go. Or they are going to display it again to impress the visitors in the main entrances of the houses, and then eventually in the courtyards, but always external. There is no need for you to classify. The very point here, it's not so much for you to study, to understand, but to admire with awe, with wonder, with surprise, to be impressed by the richness, the power of the family, more than his or her knowledge of the arts. And that's the main difference here, because after Winkelmann, all those fragments, those sarcophagi that used to be displayed randomly in the entrances and the gardens, they're going to be ordered, classified. So they will become objects, not of contemplation, but of study, of understanding. And this is a process that, interestingly, when it comes to the periodization, relates to another process, the organization of our knowledge of nature. And while Winkelmann was trying to find criteria to rearrange, to reorganize the iconographies, to distinguish what is a portrait, what is a figure, what is a torso, what is a vase, etc., simultaneously, we have, within the same years, other kinds of collectible items being rearranged, nature-oriented. And not only that, we have the earliest treatises in which nature is classified in a way that you can somehow teach, transmit. So the main kind of attention that Winkelmann was providing and was giving to the arts, this man, Carl Linnaeus, was giving also to the natural world. Now remember when we first talked about Pliny the Elder? Nature and art versus or with. Art had to reach forms of representation that are closer to nature. Sometimes nature is going to imitate art, so they are deeply entangled. Now we have, indeed, even the narratives of the knowledge of the arts, archaeology, related to our understanding in our system of classification of nature. In fact, Linnaeus is particularly well known for the Systema Naturae, for the system of nature, published in 58 for the first time. And in Dresden, so we are talking about the same context in which Winkelmann was operating. So he knew, being a librarian. And more importantly, what we have here is a system of classification according to very rational and very specific categories. So we have, for instance, class, order, genre, species, and so forth. And Winkelmann was trying to find the same kind of categorization within the periodization. And, interestingly, there is a quote from Linnaeus that I think it's very effective in this regard. Whatever Deus creavit, Linnaeus disposuit. So whatever God created, Linnaeus organized. And that's exactly the leitmotif also behind the historiographical construction of Winkelmann. And I know that it may sound random, this kind of connection of interpretation, but it's not, because we're talking about two systems, art and nature, that since the antiquity, they have been set together. So when Linnaeus was trying to find materials, modes, procedures to arrange, organize, and know better nature, so was Winkelmann. And not only that, but we know for sure that the first general periodization of the entire history of painting in Italy, first published in 1809 by Abbot Luigi Lanza, the Storia Pittorica dell'Italia, or the pictorial history of Italy, or the history of painting in Italy, was directly based on Linnaeus' criteria. Linnaeus is mentioned in the very introduction. So what we have is a system that it's very Aristotelian, from general to specific. So you have classes, you have then species, and everything must be named properly, which means that you have to train your eyes and identify criteria for you to identify techniques. A fresco is not a watercolor, which is not an oil painting, which is not a metal painting, which is not, and that kind of classification had never been attempted before systematically. Oh, of course, in Pliny the Elder's narrative, in Vasari's narrative, here and there were those themes. But now, Luigi Lanza put them all together. The key word here is systematicity. So he's creating for the first time a systematic, a system-based knowledge and therefore understanding of the arts. Not biographies, not curiosities, not taste or preferences, but something rational, scientifically based. So first of all, from general Italy, he is going to use a criterion that it's no longer periodization, or at least not plain periodization. First, the geography, the so-called schools of art. And this is going to be highly influential to the point that many museums that were archaeologically redesigned according to Winkelmann's ideas, now the collections of paintings, they're going to be redesigned according to Luigi Lanza's idea. And unfortunately, the guy has been neglected and forgotten. He's no longer as famous as Winkelmann, but he was deeply, highly influential, not only on an European level, but he was translated and well-known in America as well. So first, the geography, Italy, France, Spain. In his case, it's very clear, I am going to devote my encyclopedic knowledge to Italy. That's the one I know best, and more importantly, I have access to archives and sites. Then, within the large Italy frame, he's going to focus on different schools. Bologna, Venice, Florence, Naples, which means that periodization is no longer that progress, that overwhelmingly generic and general, but it is contextualized. What has happened in Venice is related to the very history and the peculiarity of that location. In Venice, then, after the geographical arrangement, he's going to use a chronology, or what we would call the periodization. And here, he's going to borrow from Pliny, but more massively from Vasari, improving on Vasari. So he's going to chronologically see the different styles. And in that regard, he's very Winkelmann, because he's not going so much to stress names as style. So there will be a style that is typically Venetian on the top and beyond the individuality of its masters. So Venetian is different from Bolognese, from Roman, from Florentine, etc. Then in the chronology, he's going from what appears to be the earliest to the latest. And he's going to reach from Vivarini in the 14th century up to Tintoretto in late 16th, but also in 18th century art. And this is really impressive. Some examples provided by Luigi Lanza, the book was published in 1809, they date back 1808. He even mentions the destruction that occurred in Italy after the invasion of Napoleonic troops. And we're talking about 1797, and then all the negotiations for the re-expedition of the artworks, the statues, in 1806. So he was really updated and well-informed historically. And not only that, but that's really something new. The periodization doesn't refer to the general society. In Venice, you have the 14th, Vivarini, and then you have the 16th Tintoretto. But within the biography, you do have a fluctuation of styles. You have an early Tintoretto that is very different than the late Tintoretto. This is so helpful Because aside from the periodization, we have yet another very interesting but also problematic approach, the biography. We use names as though they were rock solids, as though Michelangelo has been always Michelangelesque, as the same Michelangelo from 1492 is the Michelangelo of 1562, which is not. Behind the name, the unified force of a name, there are multiple creative moments. And some of them, they may be very different from your narratives, your perception of the artist. If you are aware of what Van Gogh looks like at the beginning of his career, my goodness, you would be surprised. Go to Portland. I hope that the painting is still there, because last time it was not. But when you go to the gallery, the Modern Art Gallery, in the very first floor, shortly after the staircase to the right, there is this beautiful chariot with a cow, which looks like Rembrandt, and it's Van Gogh. And I just love going with my students there because, oh, Van Gogh? No, it's not possible. That has nothing to do. Precisely the point that here Luigi Lanza, for the very first time, is paying attention to. Periodization, not in the large scale, but in the minutest one, within the biographies. We do have periods. And now we are familiar. We even use periods. Picasso's blue phase, Picasso's rose, pink, etc., etc. But this is the very pioneering moment in which chronology is not only contextual, it's individual as well. Well, and then he's going also to be a major source for the remodeling of museums. But there is, alongside with these very pragmatic art historians or those narratives of manufacts, there is a philosopher that I would like to consider today before finishing our conversation. The one who in those years, in fact, 2 years earlier, in 1807, have published the Phenomenologie des Geistes, Hegel, the phenomenology of the spirit. If you're familiar with Hegel, he has built a system of periodization of art that has nothing to do with movements, with style, with different forms related to civilizations, but those are the expression of ideas through forms. How ideas, thoughts, can be materialized through forms, through systems of forms that could be architectural, sculptorial, pictorial, so forms and ideas. He provides a periodization, Messer Hegel, that is very unique and could be also confusing because he uses words that we've already used, but with completely different philosophical implications. He establishes 3 major periods in the ways in which the spirit of humankind has materialized itself in art, or in forms of expression, as he puts it. The first one is the symbolic. The second one, the classical. And the third one, the romantic. But it doesn't have anything to do with romanticism or classical art necessarily. So it's slightly misleading, the terminology. In fact, he claims that there are 2 elements in art that are equally substantial. Art is a form of expression. There is some kind of intuition that it's first and foremost individual. And that's when someone such as Caspar David Friedrich, here in The Wanderer in the Sea of Fog, he is just observing the infinity of the world and maybe of destiny. And this painting somehow reverberates his feelings, his ideas, his creative agenda. That's what we could call, along with Hegel, the Geist, which is the materialization of a psychology, of a personal inner life, so something that is subjective, the Geist. But then, within a period, whenever we are expressing our ideas, we tend to exchange them. So some of those ideas, originally individual, they're going to become common. In fact, they're going to become commonplaces, cliches. That's when we're going to have the prevailing form of a period, the typical materialization of collective tendencies. And that's the zeitgeist, or the spirit of the time. So the zeitgeist of 16th century is very different from the zeitgeist of the 18th century because they are collective, community-oriented tendencies. And within these two elements, we do have certain forms in which art has been created or expressed thoughts. The first one, as I mentioned, is the symbolic. But the symbolic doesn't refer to a chronology. So the periodization that Hegel is providing here is not so much chronologically oriented as intellectually driven. In which ways, for instance, we can express our ideas? Through forms. And those forms, they may be evocative and not literally related to the ideas that we're trying to express. And that's exactly the symbolic form of art. In the symbolic form, we have a fracture, we have a distance between the idea and the form. They are not necessarily tied. And in fact, the form suggests ambiguity, mystery, vagueness, something that you have to think about. It's not an illustration of an idea. So for instance, if I would like to evoke symbolically motion, I could use certain symbols, according to Hegel. And the best medium or form of art that embodies the symbolism is architecture, because it's never literal, it's never illustrative, but evocative. And the best of all examples in architecture, Egyptian art. What could be more symbolically suggestive of the idea of afterlife, of death, than the very geometric shape of a pyramid? It does not illustrate the form or the concept, the content of death, but it is a symbolic materialization, an evocative form. It's not a skull, it's not a decayed form, a triangle. So it is a symbol. And it's not only Egyptian art. The symbolic art could be used also in 19th century, Hegel would argue. So it's not a periodization according to time, but according to the expressions of the spirit, which is timeless. Or, on the other hand, we have the second form of expression, the classical one. Opposite to the symbolic, we have a perfect symbiosis. Form and content, idea and expression, they are unified. And that's indeed the classical art in which you have the full interpretation between external forms and internal contents. Sculpture is the best of all forms of expression, according to Hegel, and particularly Greek art. So if I would like to express the very idea of motion, symbolically, I could use, and Leonardo did, the spiral. But classically, no. We do have these kind of examples. So you look at, there is no ambiguity, there is no indetermination. The form expresses immediately its content. The idea is fully materialized. No contrast, no evocation, no suggestion. An illustration of a high degree. That's the classical tendency. But then you do have a third, and that's possibly the most intricate one. Not the opposite, in which you have no relation whatsoever between form and content, except for the symbolic unification, or in the classical, a complete fusion, but you have the romantic, which must not be confused with romanticism. That's not what Hegel is talking about. He's not referring to the 18th, early 19th century movement, but he's talking about tendencies of the zeitgeist, of the spirit. And according to this definition, a romantic art is any form of highly internalized art, so internalized that it's going to be subjective. Every form will be codified according to the wishes, desires, frustrations, agendas of an individual. And because of that, we are going to have almost ungraspable contents. It's the most enigmatic and the highly metaphorical form of art because it's not previously codified by language or common use. Triangle, for instance, had been described also by Plato. So you could have some kind of historical, conceptual roots for the idea of death, afterlife, and the triangle, but not in the Romantic art. In the Romantic tendency of art, you are going to have so internalized the forms that each artist is going to create his, her, or their specific forms of expression. And that's the beginning of the end. Because according to Hegel, when art becomes so subjective, so internalized, there is no longer general tendencies. We have the over-fragmentation. We have the individualizations of the subject. And therefore, zeitgeist explodes, vanishes. That's what he refers to as the end of art. Because art has become a form of subjectivity and no longer a form of expression of common spirits or tendencies. And in that regard, that's the opening of our postmodern condition, if you will. A state of fragmentation in which I set the contents, I set the meanings of my own devices, of my own experiments. And very often, we have this, I wouldn't say frustrating, I'm always so stimulated by, but you have this experience, awkward sometimes, of not knowing what you're looking at. Go to contemporary art exhibitions. Go to Venice Biennale. Go to Castle Documenta. Okay, because of this ultra-subjectivity of the forms. They're so related to one particular method, creative agenda, that unless you don't know the specificity of that research, you are literally on the sea. And there is no Moby Dick to read you out. So you are really ungraspable. And painting, according to Hegel, is the best of all mediums to express this form of interiority. And much for my first dismay and surprise, of all iconographies that he refers to as deeply interiorized, deeply internalized Dutch still lifes. Divine every day. So according to Hegel, this is the ultimate expression of Romantic art, in which the spirit is so internalized that even the most common, functional, and absolutely irrelevant form, a spoon, a knife, a glass, have become objects of aesthetic attention. For you to look with different eyes. Because what you're looking at is not just symbolic, but somehow metaphorically internalized. It expresses other ideas. So that's what he would say, the transfiguration of commonplaces. You have all the most banal functions or utensils or items of your routine, but they are no longer routine-like. They have acquired a new sense, a new dimension. So for Hegel, that's one of the most powerful elements of art, when it transfuses what is so well known into unknownness. So you are always stimulated to look at or to explore it from a different perspective. So no longer a periodization in the sense that we've described, but a much more internalized form of understanding arts according to creative agendas. Of course, there would have been many other subjects and examples for me to discuss, but as I said, since we have barely 12 days to spend together, I couldn't face them all. But if you do have questions about any other protagonists of this potential narrative of periodization that I didn't address, I'll be more than happy to discuss with you. So thank you. Thank you so much for your attention.
Hello.
Yes.
Thank you, Dr. Santos. Bob Muir. I had hundreds of questions along the way, but I'm going to only ask you the last one. I would like to know what your response is to this. It has to do with the explosion of the zeitgeist, Hegel's last stage.
Mm-hmm.
I am a docent, and I'm a docent because I want to learn, and I'm learning all the time, I think. And what has occurred to me,
Mm-hmm.
because we have many contemporary exhibits of contemporary art over at Halley Ford. What occurs to me when you don't have the common language,
Mm-hmm.
which serves as an interface between the viewer, the patron, and the artist, what you have is the encounter with the visual itself. In other words, it isn't what it means; it's what you do with it. The artist is playing, experimenting with ideas of form, color, and so forth, and then you go in and you do the same thing
Mm-hmm.
with what they left behind. And in that, there is a closeness, a proximity, an intimacy between the viewer and the artist, which is lacking and actually barred when you have the cultural interface of,
Mm-hmm.
of taught meanings, of vocabulary, so
Mm-hmm.
to speak. I think that is what postmodernism offers as a substitute for the loss of the common language. What do you think about that?
Sometimes knowledge can be paralyzing because very often, instead of having the experience of what you are looking at, the sculpture, the painting you are trying to have an interaction with, you overproject and anticipate. So for instance, in the very selective process, when you go to a museum, you know that at Musée du Louvre, you're going to find A, B, C. So you prepare yourself, not only the itinerary, but once you're facing Mona Lisa, impossible to see, you have already answered your questions. And that's very, very dangerous, I would say. That's what Jean Dubuffet has called once the wilderness of the asphyxiating culture. There is an asphyxiante culture when culture is no longer liberating and helping you to think according to your own means, but imposes meanings. On the other hand, I am growing very, very cautious about what an artist intended to express or what could be the projections of a viewer. In semiotics, very often we have, especially in the one codified by Umberto Eco, you have the triad of this communication process. You have what could be referred to as the agenda, the intentions of the artist, intentio auctoris, whatever the artist might have planned or might have wanted to express. Then you have, on the other hand, what the receiver, the beholder, the viewer can anticipate or know, intentio lectoris. But between those two, whatever the artist may have planned and whatever the reader intended or understood, there is the intentio operis. There is the work itself. So I myself, I spend much more humbly and attentively hours trying to look at the work and listen to its voices. Because indeed, compositionally, chromatically, morphologically, there are some eloquent possibilities that maybe you could be misled by what you think you know or you were expected to. For instance, if you're looking at a Michelangelo or a Pablo Picasso, you all know that Pablo Picasso is notoriously related to Cubism. And then you go to Musée Picasso in Paris, and you start from the so-called neoclassical room, in which there are any forms except cubists. You have to reassess yourself. But that's the point. Maybe if you didn't have that kind of anticipation, you would have looked at those works with a degree of attention, and I keep using this ethical term, humility, that it's so necessary. Because one of the best points of looking at art is that art speaks to you. And not that you are colonizing, you are hunting it because you know what it's supposed to mean. That's the opposite. You're caging it. You're framing, this, or very often categorization or nomenclature can be, this is Bellini, this is Titian, this is, okay, I know, you are well informed. But so what? What is this Titian about? What is it that reverberates? What is it that you are
taken from the experience of art and not just the knowledge of art. I don't see the knowledge as something against or aggressively distant from the experience. That's the reason I keep teaching it. But you have to pay attention to the degree of your miscommunication with the work. So is it I that I'm seeing, or is it actually the work that's showing me? As for the intentio auctoris, really? How can you possibly know what Leonardo might have meant while painting Mona Lisa? By psychoanalyzing Mona Lisa? I didn't get any productive information out of those methodologies. So it's very true that very often you do have even a very clear manifesto. I wanted to express blah, blah, blah. And that's the romantic art, according to Hegel. When you recodify something according to your subjectivity. Very fine. But it doesn't mean that the fullest meaning is the one that you intended. Maybe you didn't know, but you were saying even more than what you said. Stories, they tell us many things, but very often they tell us stories that the stories didn't know they are telling us. So being attentive, open-minded, humbly trying to, that's my position, really. Not that I know what. I went recently to Belgrade, fought the snow from Sarajevo, arrived in Belgrade because there was, for the first time after 40 years, the major retrospective of Marina Abramovic, a performer. Because I was so curious, after 3 decades of looking photographs, looking at pictures, I wanted to experience the originals. But then I was concerned about that. Oh my God, I know so much about what I'm expected to be like and how am I supposed to act that I'm going to act freely? I think I did. There was the snow talk. So thank you for your question, absolutely. Very complex.
This is Jim. Like Bob, I had a million questions. I mean, you brought all sorts of thoughts to mind as you spoke about the various times in art. I thought of Winkelmann or Winkelmann? Winkelmann, I think.
Winkelmann.
Yeah, Winkelmann.
Well, I know that many art historians, Abi Warburg, for instance, with the W, they are Germans. So in German, you would say V.
Right.
But
Well,
Winkelmann,
thinking of
that's
him,
fine.
I also thought...
I've been called Richardo, so that's fine.
It made me think of Gaston Bachelard. I don't know if you ever read his things in the Poetics of Space, and he wrote a bunch of books
Of course.
on space. And it made me think of an experience I had. In the old days, I would go to the Louvre when it was half empty. I'd go late or early.
Miraculous old days.
Yeah, and I'd go into the basement and look at the Venus de Milo in that beautiful round space, all by yourself, nobody else there. And I was
That
just...
was really long ago, Jim.
Yeah, it might have...
Mass tourism has arrived.
I think it had more to do with the times that I was there, perhaps.
From 3:15 to 3:20 a.m. Good choice.
But they've changed her position and the renovation, and I was extremely disappointed. And I asked myself, is it because of the change in space, or is it because now she's at the end of a room, or is it because of my own, what's in my head and expectations? What do you think about that?
That's a very good question, because very often, as Winkelmann was so influential about, it's not only the item, the object, but the way in which it is displayed. In fact, not only our experience, and I would say our, momentarily at least, understanding and knowledge of the artwork changes depending on its location. But you may not even notice that. Case in point, I was visiting the Hermitage Museum in St. Petersburg, and there are 2 Leonardo da Vinci's, or allegedly 2 Leonardo da Vinci's in one room. One, well documented, at the very beginning, the so-called Benoit Madonna, and then on the other side, the more disputable, and I don't believe it's a Leonardo, Madonna Lita. But because it was named and labeled Leonardo, lines and lines and lines. And because I had a grant and I was expected to take a picture, I am ashamed of that, but I had to, just to send to the, to the promoters. I've been there, I touched it. So I had to wait in a line. Right next door, there was this little statue which was not in the center. It was slightly decentered, of this little boy looking at his knee. Sort of a rocky-looking, rounded figure in the middle of the room. Vroom, all masses go through, all masses gone by. Then eventually there would be that more curious sheep who would stop and would read, oh, Michelangelo! And then, oh, busy and around, and that's it. So location, it is important for these very ephemeral examples, but also for more, I would say, manipulative agendas. I was talking about Madonna Benoit. Very recently, not even 2 months ago, I was invited by the Renaissance Society of America to write an article, not about Leonardo, but about the celebrations of the 2019 commemorations of Leonardo da Vinci. As you may have heard, well, Leonardo died in 1519, so that's the 500th anniversary of his departure. There have been documentaries, exhibitions, catalogs, very few worth it, really. And I'm not saying that out of pedantic statements, but really there is an inflation, an overproduction. Even the cultural industry has a major responsibility about that. And in fact, Leonardo da Vinci has become such a symbol, to use Hegel's terminology, that very often he is misappropriated. In Fabriano, a little town close to Assisi, 1 year ago, the city has been listed within the very prestigious list of protected towns from UNESCO. It's a major deal, not only in terms of art historical conservation, but also the local finances. Because, of course, the increase of the tourism and the attention and the money from the European community, etc. Well, Fabriano is well known for many artists, including Gentile da Fabriano, one of the most stimulating early Renaissance masters. Well, guess what? In order to celebrate this new position of Fabriano, they had an exhibition in which they literally emptied the local museum to display just one work, Leonardo's Madonna Benoit. You would enter, the whole museum was just like an abandoned cathedral, empty, dark, no lights, except that very subtle light that would allow you to move around, almost as though it was a rite of passage. You were going through a sort of an alchemical garden, and then you would go through all the rooms, and eventually, just like a rising star, the Madonna Benoit, suspended, metaphysical, just like an archaeopoetic image in the Middle Ages. I knelt down and, oh, please, heal myself, right? I felt that I was going to Medjugorje, Lourdes, Fatima. It was this kind of mythical and religious experience. But again, is that really what the work is about? And more importantly, this mythical state or stature that Leonardo has reached, that work, and don't get me wrong, I love that work, but I love many other works. But decontextualizing and manipulating our expectations as to exchange the emotional engagement with the work as a religious-like experience seemed a little off to me, really. So indeed, depending on the lighting, how come that nowadays in many exhibitions you have the spotlight in the work, so the work emerges in all its autonomy? Well, isn't it wonderful when it interconnects and talks to the other works? So why is it that we're selecting the so-called masterpieces, forgetting that many other pieces are masters made as well? My most frustrating experience this year, as one of many Leonardo's experts, I really wish that this year, finally, we could talk about anything but Leonardo. There are so many problems, historically documented, gaps, collaborators whose identities, biographies, works we don't know because they are constantly overshadowed by the myth of Leonardo. Guess what happened? I myself and another wonderful colleague, we published about other artists. Otherwise, it was Leonardo, Leonardo, and Leonardo. And the others, they are sometimes, especially in the exhibition currently at display at Musée du Louvre, they are there in a very humiliating position so they can somehow clarify the greatness of Leonardo because they are not great. is this what art is about? To establish hierarchies, distinctions that are so dry, instead of creating really unifying conversations? So for that matter, I'm very attentive about locations and contextualizations, but in a way that it's not this kind of mythical emerging of the ethereal artwork. Art is man-made, thanks God.
And thank you, Professor. I wish we had more time.